So, good evening. I'm back a little bit faster than I thought. But as you saw my post here, I have been digging a little bit through these JFK files. And I found an interesting link, as you saw, to the German General Reinhard Gehlen. And Gehlen, of course, was quite a colorful figure. And he was in the latter years of the Wehrmacht career, in his Wehrmacht career, the commanding officer for the Fremde Heere Ost, which was the intelligence unit of the Eastern Front Wehrmacht divisions, where he would collect all sorts of intelligence on the Russians and on artisans and that sort of stuff, who were fighting against the German military during those days. He was there right from the beginning, and prior to this he was actually in Greece when they invaded Crete, the island of Crete, and that sort of stuff. But this particular document, or the collection of documents in that segment I came across there, evolves around, was a plan by the CIA, which originated about 1959, when Eisenhower was still president, to assassinate Castro, because they had already discovered that there were, revolutionary tendencies in Cuba, with Batista had come to power and that sort of stuff. And they were looking at this, and they figured that Fidel Castro may be a problem at one point or another. So by 1960, when Castro was pretty much fully established, they hatched a plan to assassinate him. And that plan was called, or that group was called, Mangoose. Operation Mangoose, or Group Mangoose, which should go into effect as the Operation Mangoose then at that point. And as we know, is that Fidel Castro died many, many decades later of natural causes. We know that this plan was never put into action. But the interesting part is of all the people who were involved in this. And it basically starts out with one person at the CIA, a CIA agent named Seyfield Edwards. He was with D Security, that was the division security, and he was sort of with Harvey, that is the last name of the other CIA agent, Harvey, in charge of this, putting that Mangoose group together. And Edwards had what they call in intelligence circles, informants, and the East Germans called that at the Stasi informelle Mitarbeiter. These are basically freelancers, so to speak, and they usually get paid for the work they do, depending on how much they do and that sort of stuff. And there was a fellow named by the name of Maheu, M-A-H-E-U, and he was retained on retainer by the CIA, which like a lawyer. So you call him in when you need him, and you give him money every week. So he was getting like a regular paycheck, but he wasn't always on duty. Maheu was the one, or Mahiu. I'm not exactly sure on how to pronounce it. I have not found his first name yet. Reported directly to Agent Edwards. And Mahiu was also the one who organized the Hollywood starlets, or starlets, what they referred to ladies to in the papers. Basically, ladies who get paid for providing services to men, to put it that way, in a nice way. And he had a contact, Mahiu had another contact, which was Roselli. And Roselli had contacts with Sam Giancana in Chicago. He was one of the mob bosses in Chicago, who also had then contact to Santo Trafficante Jr. down in Florida, who was the boss in Florida of the Italian mob families here. So this was the plan, that Mahai, who supplied the CIA with the starlets, would go and talk to Wazelli he was affiliated with, and Wazelli would go, or did go, to Sam Giancana in Chicago and told him they want to kill Castro, and then Giancana went to Santo Trafficante Jr. To have him go to Cuba and kill Castro by the means of chemical poisoning, and I will get to that in a minute. Now, Trafficante knew Fidel Castro personally, I guess back from the days when they operated the casinos down there before Batista came into power down there, and he was basically also the mob boss from those mid-50s in Cuba. And of course, there's other more qualified people out there. I'm thinking of Sammy the Bull Gavano or Michael Francesi, who probably can explain all of this stuff a lot better than I can. But these are the names the papers clearly identify, where they actually named as participants in this entire Mangoose operation. And so this is the interesting part. Now, you may wonder on how the German head of the BND, which General Reinhard Gehlen then became, I think by 1956, they called it the BND. That stands for Bundesnachrichtendienst and is the German equivalent to the CIA for Germany, for West Germany. In East Germany, it was the Stasi, and in West Germany, it is still today, for all of Germany, it is the BND. And they had gotten their headquarters then, I think at that time, in Pullach, which is a small town in the suburbs southwest of Munich, if I remember that correctly. So, and he had made his way all these years through from 1921, when he joined as a young man. He was 18 at the time, the newly established Reichswehr with that limit of 100,000 men, which was part of the Versailles treaty. So he started out in the officers as a cadet, basically, training in there. And he was also, what most people don't know, was a member of the organization Consul, which had the aim in preventing German politicians to sign off on the Versailles Treaty because of the very bad terms the Versailles Treaty had, or was being proposed there, which Germany or the Weimar Republic should have signed off at that point, which they eventually did, and that caused a whole bunch of problems. And the organization Consul later on also assassinated several politicians in the early years of the Weimar Republic, and then by 1924, I believe, they were outlawed by the Weimar Republic, but they were still operatives at this time, but they did no longer kill any politicians. So, and Gehlen was part of that. So was my great-granduncle, Friedrich Heinrich, and my grandfather to a limited extent. My grandfather was born in 1901, and Reinhard Gehlen was born 9 months later in 1902. We're not related to it, but because of Gehlen went to high school in Breslau because of his father was transferred there in his later years, pretty much beginning like 1910 or so, somewhere around there. And we had the castle in Kamenz, which is approximately 40 kilometers southwest. In those years, that's when he became aware or part of the Breslau chapter of the organization Consul, with my great-granduncle involved being in the Breslau chapter. And so that's how he got to know my great-granduncle and my grandfather, and they were basically both the same age. My grandfather passed away in 1976. Gehlen passed away in 1979. That is about all I know to the extent of what I can tell you. Now, they informed Gehlen of this now because the CIA, as well as the military and NASA, had employed many German scientists and military leaders here in the United States. All of the people basically, like, what was his name, the rocket guy here, maybe I remember that, Werner von Braun. Yeah, Werner von Braun. He was here in the United States working on this whole Apollo program, and so were many other scientists. And one group, which this paper refers to as the Germans in there, are the scientists, chemists who worked for the Technical Service Division, TSD, for the CIA. And these people, these German chemists, were expert in lethal warfare, in chemical warfare, and their particular expertise was to develop poisons similar to the Cyclone B. I do not know if they did develop the Cyclone B or not, but this was basically that group of people who came up with this. They came from IG Farben in Mannheim, I believe, or Ludwigshafen, and they were mostly Nazi members, regular Nazi members. Some of them were Wehrmacht members, some of them were SS members, and they were basically shipped off here to the United States, and they ended up living here and working for the government. There were, I think, close to 10,000 Germans who came or were brought over here to the United States with mostly technical backgrounds and then scientific backgrounds, physics, chemistry, biology, and that sort of stuff. The people from the nuclear program, Adolf Hitler's nuclear program, came over here for the better part. And then, you know, people who came out of the SS and other people out of the Gehlen group there, Fremde Heere Ost. There were many officers and agents which were adopted into the system here after the war, and they were brought over here then specifically once the Cold War started and the Soviet Union and communism started to develop as a enemy or a potential threat to the United States. What really scared the United States and many Western Europeans at that time was the force the communists used to expropriate properties and businesses and that sort of stuff. And that was the last thing anyone wanted here in the United States or in other parts of Europe. So the enemy from until 1945 became one of the biggest assets to the Western world in fighting communism, because they had fought against the Soviet Union and the communism. And that made clear to many people that Adolf Hitler's dislike, which he had written out in Mein Kampf about communism, was well-founded, and it was even worse than what most people had anticipated here. So they didn't want no part whatsoever of any of this here, whether within the population or, you know, coming in from the outside and having Fidel Castro having a revolution over there in Cuba, and they got communism now with Soviet assistance directly in front, 90 miles from Florida, was not something the United States was very thrilled about it, I can tell you that much, or in any other Latin American country for that matter. So we have now the interaction here. So the German scientists are now at the CIA developing the poison. I forgot to write it down here on my little notepad here. What it was, I can put it in the description, see if I can find it. And it was a poison which you could not taste or anything, but was instant. And so that was developed by them. And then the idea was that Trafficante Trafficante would go over there to Cuba, meet Castro, and put that poison into his drink. Castro would basically die, and Trafficante would basically leave. That was sort of what the idea was, something to that tune for the better part. And this is all written out in detail about this. Now, what this proves is what many members or former members of the American Mafia have stated here online on YouTube, is that the U.S. government, had solicited their services. That is actually true. And it is probably by far more than what anyone had ever anticipated. There is a lot of shady characters in this whole intelligence environment to begin with. And here we can see on how this all went through, because it is all documented. So now, in terms of the JFK assassination, there is quite a possibility there that this went a similar way as they were trying to proceed, where they actually actively solicited Trafficante to poison Fidel Castro. That is written black and white in that document. I will put the document numbers underneath there where you can look at this. And when you look at these things, then we understand that this was all very different of what was sold to the public. With this holy church Sunday thing here and this, that, and the other thing, the realities of defending apparently capitalism took quite drastic different measures than praying in church on a Sunday morning and going to Wednesdays to Bible study, and staying away from bars and, wild women and that sort of stuff. So there's two different worlds here which are really colliding in it. I don't think the United States needs to be ashamed of this. The Germans are as involved in this, and the BND had similar operations all around the world too during that time with Gehlen. They were specialized in this, like Gehlen had learned that with the assassination, which were carried out in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic against socialist political leaders and that sort of stuff. They really targeted the organization. What was it now called? I got the organization. I almost said Organization Castro, but it is the Organization Consul and Castro. Not quite the same, but you can get a brain blockage here for a second. They did primarily, like I said, is object to politicians who were actively negotiating with the Allied forces at that time, primarily the French, the Versailles Treaty. And so there were, I think, 3 or 4 assassinations carried out, which were successful, and I think 1 or 2 of them failed. And they had, of course, learned a lot in this, which was later than all, kind of used as a blueprint here with Trafficante to actually assassinate Fidel Castro. So I've learned more about the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, the absolute dislike of the U.S. government in general, no matter what party it was, of communism and socialism, the deep concern these people had that this would take hold here in the United States among the population, and on how vigorously it was combated. That is really the biggest lesson to learn out of this here. Again, we have this now basically in writing. We know now that the CIA did operate to the extent and even more than what we thought they did. And we have the actual chain of command of who approached actually who in this to carry this out and that sort of stuff. So this is highly interesting. This is because of the amount of documents. It will take probably quite some time. But this is the sort of stuff you're going to uncover. I uncovered that now in 2, 3, 4, 5 files, which I had to carefully read through. And of course, what helps now is with the redactions removed, you can actually read the names of the people. So now you know who was CIA and who was actually a outside person outside who was the liaison, who was that, freelancer, the informal informant, or the informant they used who was on a retainer who got paid, and that sort of stuff. And then you get a much better idea, because the way this operation worked, probably every other assassination attempt would have been carried out in a similar fashion. So it is quite possible that we find in these files somewhere a reference that one group of CIA officers or agents actually contacted one of the informants, who then contacted, in the next step, a member of the American Mafia. And then it went through the chain of command within the American Mafia to be carried out eventually. This is the case with that killer, the person who shot Lee Harvey Oswald at the police station. I forgot now his name. Ruby? I forgot it. Anyway, you probably know who I'm talking about. That was the fellow who assassinated the assassin. And that is said that he had mafia ties. He was a strip club owner. And here again, we have the same kind of scheme in here. You have this Mahoy fellow who can supply women to the government, for certain purposes. And that guy then also is connected through Roselli in Giancana to Trafficante. So it's one middleman that they basically have an informant who can go straight to the mafia, who then sets the whole chain into command to the bosses in Chicago and Florida. So within 2 people, you're at the boss in Chicago and in Florida at the same time, literally. And that is quite interesting. So they didn't go to any street soldiers or low-ranking mafia members. This one, I guess that Roselli may have been a captain somewhere, or consigliere. Like I said, is, our Sammy the Bull Gravano or Mike Francesi here, they probably know this a lot better than I know. I know that I can read the names to you, but that's about it. I don't know nothing. So maybe they make a video about it. We will find out. Anyway, this was what I wanted to let you know. And with that, you have a great evening.